minute. We're still seeing some registrants walk in the virtual door here in the last minute, so bear with us. Good morning, good afternoon, and actually now that I looked at the list of registrants and attendees, a couple of you even good evening. Thanks for joining here, the fourth installment of the GlassIG webinar series. Today's topic is on the notion of governance analytics, and we'll take a close look at Infonomics. For some of you, this will be the first time to get introduced to that. Some of you have dialed in specifically because you've got some familiarity with Infonomics and you're wondering what our take on that is. So hopefully we'll be able to hit on all those for you today. As is often the case for us, we're going to begin with the commercial for installment number 5. That is the next in our series of webinars. It will be approximately 6 weeks from now. I say approximately, I think it's now exactly 6 weeks from now, Tuesday, June 27th, where we will dive deeply into how GlassIG handles the information inventory, searching and accessing items under governance and managing the metadata associated with those. So that's going to be a little more fine-grained demonstration than what you'll see today. Today's time will be a little more conceptual. We'll still provide some time at the end for some demonstrations. But anyway, on your calendars, go ahead and block off 6 weeks from today to dive deeply into inventory management. Okay, 2 hosts. I'm the guy on the left. My name is James Amsler, and in a minute I'll let Stefan introduce himself as well. We are the 2 voices you'll hear today, primarily mine, and then Stefan will jump in near the end of our time. I run sales for GlassIG, and I've been focused on this space and on this technology for coming up on 8 years now, and in particular, at least as far as today's topic goes, I should let you know that I used to be a developer. So although I've crossed the boundary and I'm a customer-facing person these days, that wasn't always the case. I used to be a developer, and I worked for SAP, and one of my areas of focus was on what was then called the SAP Business Warehouse. And so I'm going to use some of those experiences today as we dive into the topic of analytics and how that branches into IG. Stefan, I'm going to turn it over to you to say a few words about yourself and what you'd like our audience to know about you, and then we'll get started.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon for the one in Europe. So my name is Stéphane Croisier. I'm the Chief Product Officer here at GlassIG and the General Manager, so in charge mainly of the product strategy for the past 7 years on the Glass platform. So I started my career, so 15 years of information management and content management career and experience. I started mainly on the web content management industry, then moved to ECM, then search engine, and finally, so 7 years in the information governance space, where I was mainly in charge of the product management team for this product.
Thank you, Stefan. And as I said earlier, you'll hear again from Stefan near the end of our time. The Infonomics deliverable actually began as a bit of an academic exercise with a university in the Geneva area, and Stefan was the leader on our end of that interaction, and he'll tell you more about that. All right, so before we get going, housekeeping item. We're scheduled for an hour today. I don't think we'll take quite that, but we'll see. And then second, those of you who are veterans in our series, you already know this, but for the rest of you, if you've got any comments or questions that arise during our time here, I invite you to register those in the chat window. We've got some folks that are monitoring that in the background, and they'll nudge me as need be to address any questions or hit on any comments. Sometimes we have so many we can't quite get to all of them. In that case, we'll follow up directly via email afterwards. So here's the story. As you'll hear today, I'm big on stories, and here's a story I'm going to tell you today. First, we'll take maybe 5 minutes to look over the history of the analytics space itself, particularly as it relates to IT and business intelligence. Those of you with deep expertise may find this a little bit rudimentary, but it's important because at the time that analytics were being developed and growing, there were also some evolutions happening on the records management and information governance space. And what I'm going to leave you with today is that we are or have just passed the point where those two converged to bring added value not just to RIM professionals, but also to the businesses that they serve. That's the story. And within about the next half an hour, 45 minutes, I'm going to tell it. So let's get started. Chapter 1 in our story is, as I said, an introduction into business intelligence and analytics. So before we dive into that, some glossary terms, just so you know where I'm coming. When we talk about analytics, I mean something that's very general. That is the discipline of discovering information, finding meaning behind it, and then communicating that meaning, or if there are patterns, making sure that those are understood, or if there are not. Sometimes it's just as important to understand when there is no pattern to the data. Dashboards are one of several ways to tell the story. It's not the only, but sometimes people sort of conflate dashboards and analytics as synonyms. They're not. Dashboards are a means for deriving meaningful information from analytics activity. Indicators, we focus a lot on KPIs, key performance indicators, but key risk indicators, particularly in the governance space, are perhaps as important, if not more so. So back when I was working for SAP, then later I spent time as an IBM specialist in what was then called WebSphere Business Monitor, and I would understand that a person was ripe for analytics if they could identify 3 to 5 things they needed to know about their business or about their scope in order to be able to tell me how it's going. Sometimes a person would have no idea. I really have no idea what I could possibly tell you about my business to let you know how things are going. Others would have 10 or 15. So if you key performance indicators, key risk indicators, you like to focus on a handful of those that tell the overall, that provide the overall picture. So with that glossary, let's go back in time, which for me goes back to college. In my introduction, I was a math major, among other things, and I first saw Excel 2.0 in the early 1990s, and I was amazed because up to that, I had only seen things like VisiCalc and Profit Plan and you know, just basically kind of table-based tools. But Excel was the first way to provide just an ordinary person a means for visualizing data. And a lot of you are probably too young to be impressed by this, but those of you who aren't, the ability just to grab a column and then turn that into some pretty pictures was astounding. Shortly thereafter, Crystal reports and similar technologies came out that provided the means to report on that. But these were sort of snapshots. They were not dynamic. As soon as the underlying data changed, then the report itself became, I won't say obsolete, but perhaps less valuable. And then finally, moving out of the spreadsheet-based reporting to analytics. Analytics evolved the notion of reporting on static data, you know, that snapshot in time, and gave you the ability to produce pretty pictures on dynamic data, things that were always changing. And this was the time that Business Warehouse and similar tools began to emerge into the market and provide just a new way of understanding what was happening with the data. So where are we now? Well, first of all, the data that's being reported on, the data that's being gathered, is growing enormously. And most of you are information professionals, so I won't overstate this point, but instead I'll just throw buzzwords at you that analytics are becoming interactive. People are getting the ability to create their own dashboards and customize those without IT involvement. Visualizing data. So you'll see 3 different ways to visualize that, but cognitive psychologists have been studying what we're doing and saying, okay, in order to tell the story better, here are some ways that you can do that. And so mind maps and other visualizations are coming out. New data discovery tools are increasing the amount of data that's being analyzed. Performance concerns with the new volumes of data are requiring that instead of sending the data out to a separate system to be kind of worked with, that these sort of operations are being performed by systems in memory and returning results a lot more quickly. Big data and big content, we'll get to that in a second. Mobile collaboration, being able to share the data on multiple platforms and with multiple people. And then even social and cloud type of things are not only changing how analytics are being delivered, but also on what's being analyzed itself. So for information professionals today, this actually is both alarming and yet also very compelling in that there's a brand new realm, a brand new universe of content that first of all needs to be taken a look at, but then second, leveraged primarily to understand your customer better. And companies who are doing a good job with this are distancing themselves from the companies that are not. They know more about their market and about their customer than was possible 2 decades ago. So, quickly, that was the end of chapter 1. We have taken a look at analytics and a quick history. While these types of tools and use cases were being developed, in a completely different world, meanwhile back at the ranch, if you will, records management was being defined and evolved. And when it first, I guess, hit the, well, not even our industry, when records management first emerged, it solved a very different problem than what we see today. Here you see a picture from the Philadelphia Public Library back in the 50s of how proud they were to have taken these volumes, these stacks of volumes behind the gentleman on the right, and converted them into microfilm on the left, and that these books were took up so much space, and wow, the microfilm fills these cabinets. Well, records management evolved to solve a problem of this kind of scale, of keeping up with the physical assets as they emerged over time and needed to be managed over time. So years later, when the seminal work in the late 1990s was published that took those disciplines and applied them to electronic information, at first you were able to do this. And to explain why, I'll go back to one of my first jobs in IT. So I was an SAP consultant in the mid-1990s. And I was working on a project at Exxon Chemical Americas in West Houston. And I was sitting down with a woman who was an accounts receivable clerk. And she had basically done that same job since the late 70s, so almost 20 years by the time I met with her. And ostensibly, I was sitting down to understand her process. That's how I pitched the meeting anyway. And so I was asking, what types of forms do you get? What are the labels? What are the pieces of data? And she was largely non-compliant. She was upset with me. And when I got the information that I wanted, young and naive, I said, look, we're going to make your world so much easier. This is going to automate so many of your processes. And she pointed at me and she said, hey, there's nothing you could do to make my job easier. I know it in and out. You are coming in here and you are going to give us an entirely new process, a new way of doing things, and it's not going to be better. And she was upset. And well, it turned out she was right. SAP systems, ERP systems back in those days were sold as a means for automating your process, but the dirty little lie was that wasn't true. SAP systems were automating their process and foisting them on you, and the data that I gathered in those sorts of interviews were merely for field names and things like that. So that's why the early records management, electronic records management systems, that's why they were able to employ those old principles, because there was not any flexibility in the process. The process could not be customized. The systems owned the documentation. They produced records. Those records were highly structured. You knew where they were, you knew what they were going to contain, and therefore, with the structure that was in place, you could go from records management principles that applied at this stage to electronic records. Well, how does that compare with where we are today? We've already hit on the growth, but we haven't hit on the breadth of content systems and the means by which content is generated. Process is no longer king, the users are, and the systems in which they create their content can vary. So I'll ask yourselves, in your environments, in the companies you work in, and some of you are consultants, and so some of the customers that you work for, ask yourselves, how many content systems do they create things in and store things in and access things through? And it's not just ECM systems. It could be shared drives, cloud-based repositories, collaboration spaces. So therefore, we had to evolve, and that's what we, when we released RSC Glass back in 2010, that's why we called it an information governance platform rather than a records management system. So the need to manage physical records predated ERM. The RM standards came out in the late 90s, and there was a proliferation of systems that met those and applied those principles to FileNet and Documentum and OpenText and similar types of systems. But federated records management tried to apply those across multiple systems, but that approach failed at the time. So where we are now is, given the breadth of systems, you need a very different way to handle things, and that's what Glass came to represent when it was first released in 2010 as a means for defining policies, enforcing those across multiple systems wherever they are, and then being able to enforce not just retention, but in fact any kind of lifecycle, for example, storage, privacy, security, metadata-related life cycles, etc. I'm not going to provide any deeper introduction into our technology than this, partly because the majority of you have already seen it, and then second, because our focus today is on the convergence of analytics and governance. That said, if you would like to know more about this approach and about how we go about making it happen, then by all means, we'll set up something specific for you to understand what it's about. Chapter 3. And at this point, I'm going to pause to take a look in the chat window to see if there are any questions to address before we get into the notion of convergence. All right, so there's some, all right, a couple folks are saying that the sound quality is a little bit variable, so I'll ask the team in the background to see if there's anything going on with WebEx to deal with that. Otherwise, no. Okay. So Chapter 1 was the analytics. Chapter 2, governance. And I'm making the point to you now that where we are is at a point, a very exciting time in our space where the volumes of information that are being created, that's not the only place to apply analytics principles. There's also the governance tools themselves. And when you think of the breadth of information available related to policy and legal holds and storage, et cetera, that this convergence is necessary. Our customers demanded it when Glass first came out in 2000 about it today. So first, quick word on GlassIG for those of you who are new to us. We are a software company based in Geneva, Switzerland. The company itself is fairly new. It was created a little over a year ago, but the technology is not. The technology was first developed by RSC back in the late 2008, 2009 timeframe, was released in 2010, and those of you who have been to ARMA shows in the last decade recognize RSC Glass. Well, Glass was separated from the larger company a little over a year ago to be its own business, and here we are today. So the other major change that happened from the first, I'll call it, generation of Glass to where we are now is that Glass is now available as a SaaS platform. That is a cloud-based governance tool that you just simply subscribe to. And I invite you to do that. We'll finish today with that invitation for you to go to GlassIG.com and subscribe and see for yourself. So, IG programs, and how can we use analytics, and how can we use the information that can be gained from an IG program to fund it and evolve it? Well, we typically, the answer to that question has been to scare people to death. To say, hey, if you don't do IG, you're going to end up on the front cover of the Wall Street Journal. Do you want to be the next Enron? Do you want to be the next, I won't throw out any other customer names because some of those, well, anyway. Well, that works sometimes for extremely risk-averse companies and highly regulated industries. But in reality, most of those who are scared to death, well, they were already doing what they could to begin with. So we've concluded, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, that fear and uncertainty and doubt is probably not the best way to get your IT program funded. And here are some examples of how we package that. We've said storage cost and e-discovery costs, and do you want to be the next one that's experiences a very public and painful privacy breach? That approach only makes sense if you think of information as representing only costs and only risk. That information costs me money to store and access and produce, and once I have it, it merely represents risk to my organization, that it can be used against me, either by a miscreant that breaches our security systems, or by opposing counsel that will find something incriminating in it. So we trained initially our customers to make the case according to these, and looking at the roles that have joined us today, I think you'd agree with us that really hasn't worked well for either of us. Gartner says, in fact, that of every 100 companies that must implement an IG program, more or less one of them have, and 99 either can't or haven't. So we need to take a different approach. And what we are advocating today at GlassIG is not focusing merely on the cost and risk of data, but on the value of it. Doesn't information also have value? And when I deliver this presentation that you're hearing today in person, I implore the folks that are there to either nod vigorously with me, which most do, or even participate and say, yes, information has risk. So I'll ask you, wherever you are, answer me now. Doesn't information also have value? Yes, it does. So therefore, the question gets into, how do we measure that value? So, well, first of all, what is value? Infonomics answers the question of what is the value of information assets. We'll get to that in a second. How do you extract it? Well, analytics, particularly analytics applied against big content and the governance tools and initiatives that manage those. That's not possible unless you have an information governance platform that is managing the value of the lifecycle to begin with. And the output of measuring your IG program is not only do you reduce costs, but you also can put a number on that. And that number is the wind in your sails for growing the program beyond the initial scope. You also are able to measure the amounts of risks that you've mitigated and business value. So what is Infonomics? Well, I'll say just the 101 level version of it, and then I'm going to hand it over to Stefan to get into the details of how we are. But Infonomics is an emerging theory. The term was coined by Gartner, that recognizes that information has value and must be managed as an asset, just like any other corporate asset, just like your real estate, just like your printers and scanners and IT systems and delivery trucks and airplanes and whatever else is a corporate asset, that you should apply the same principles to managing your information as you do those assets. At the risk of dating myself, I was a big fan of Johnny Carson, and one of my favorite things he used to say was, "I did not know that." And he would kind of point out to the audience, "I did not know that." Did you know that although we're saying you should manage your corporate information in the same way, according to the same accounting principles as tangible assets, that current accounting practices prohibit you from doing so? You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed by, what is it? It's GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, specifically exclude information assets. Wall Street, which doesn't always have the same view of a company's value as an accountant does, disagrees. And by way of example, I'll choose the company Waze, which 5 years ago was a very small IT outfit that did some work related to GPS and socializing the concept of GPS. And that took off. I'm sure many of you are Wazers yourself. I sure am. As much as I travel, I need to have Waze tell me where to go and where the potholes are. And sometimes if I'm running late for a meeting, it's good to know where the law enforcement officers are. Well, anyway. So Waze, if you just valued Waze according to the things that show up on an accounting worksheet, Waze was not a very interesting company. It had maybe 20 people, rented some office space, had some computers, etc. Probably not much different from us in that regard. But they were so interesting from a market perspective that there was a bidding war for them. Apple bidded for them, Microsoft bidded for them, Google bidded for them, and I think eventually won, and ended up getting over $1 billion with a B dollars. I think $1.25 billion for this very small company, whose tangible assets were less than $10 million. Well, we would say that the difference between those tangible assets and what the market said Waze was worth was what you might call goodwill. That is the information that they had and were able to produce. And Infonomics takes that concept and runs with it. And so at this point, I'm now going to hand to Stefan, because once the concept of Infonomics came out, well, it was clear how that could provide value to an information governance program and an information governance technology like ours. But what was less clear was how. And as I said earlier, Stefan was the spearhead of that and working with some academics to answer that question. And Stefan, I'm now going to mute myself because these people are probably tired of hearing my voice for at least a little bit. I'm going to hand to you, and you can take the story from here.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So 3 years ago, the definition of information governance changed a bit. So from pure, let's say, enforcement of proper behavior and risk-oriented life cycle management, it moves to 3 main pillars. So the increase of the information value, the reduction of the cost, and the mitigation of the risk. So it added 2 new dimensions for record management, basically value and cost. So we ask ourselves the question, so how can we transform our system from a pure risk mitigation system to add the 2 new dimensions, the business value and the cost dimension, to every documents or records we govern into our system. So we started to look around. We were introduced to the Infonomics theory or disciplines. But basically, this discipline is quite abstract, and they are just very high-level principles. So it was very difficult, and it's very difficult to find any really thesis or how to apply these disciplines in the field. So we started to look for some research funds, mainly in Switzerland. So we were granted a 3-year research program with the University of Applied Sciences for Western Switzerland, which is one of the university in charge of all the information science here in Switzerland. And they were granted a 3-year mission to to basically study how to apply information value and information cost to all the corporate information assets. So we worked with them over the last 3 years, and the result is what you will see in a couple of minutes. So it's a data mart and a dashboard that allow any information professionals to monitor their cost and their information value over time, over the different repositories and over the different information series. So we started basically, you can start to apply Infonomics from 2 different manners. The first manner is a traditional manner. You start from a bottom-up approach. So you start from a similar approach to the only perhaps information series that every company that has patents at least can value. So usually a large company values their patents, and so you create a small group of experts, and you say my patents are worth that much. And then you can reflect these amounts to the information series which are related to these patents that you may have. So that's fine, but this approach doesn't scale at all. It's not possible to scale on millions or hundreds of millions of documents with an approach that requires every information manager or individuals to value and revalue over time their information assets. So we needed to create a top-down approach, which will be combined to this bottom-up approach, taking the goodwill that Jim introduced, so the difference between the market value and the accounting value, or part of this goodwill. It's up to every company to define which part of this goodwill is assigned to information assets. And then to create a system with allocation keys to automatically spread this value to all the information you have in your company. So basically, you can imagine that you have a certain number of customer data or customer contracts, and this customer contract you can measure the value of this information from different manner. So you have just, for example, the intrinsic value, or we can say the economic value. So the value that you may have in terms of just losing these documents and trying to replace those documents. That's really a cost-oriented approach, and you say, if I need to replace these documents, how much time it will take, and how much it will represent for the company. Then you can have another more interesting approach is to try to calculate the performance value or the business value of this information, and so based on the potential or the realized value of this information assets. So what the company can expect from this information. So that's what we try to do, and to reallocate part of this goodwill through a certain number of criteria and allocation key to the different information assets. So down to every single document. And then, of course, it's recomputed on a periodic basis, for example, every week or every month. So similar to every corporate assets, physical, tangible assets you have in your company, you can apply some depreciation over time. The interesting things with this approach is that in parallel, you can compute some cost, so based on the cost of creation or the cost of replacement of your asset, cumulated with the operating expense of your information assets. So every year, this assets needs, or this information needs to be stored in various systems. You have a price per gigabytes or price per terabytes, which doesn't include only the storage cost, but also the cost of the IT operations, the cost of the different tools that you need to purchase to maintain these assets from a proper manner, with the right level of integrity, and so on and so forth. So when you compare the value and the cost, suddenly you don't just have a flat, let's say, retention duration calculated or defined by some record and information manager. So that's the traditional way of doing it. You know that you have laws and regulations that force your company to keep this type of information assets for 7 years, and then just in case of, you keep this information assets for 20 years. But basically, you do not have any facts or measure to know if this over retention of 13 years is really valuable for the company. Is it worth only to keep this information assets for 10 years, or is it worth to keep this information asset for 30 years because the value for the company is perhaps still accurate in the next 30 years? So that's when you compare both side by side, you get a dynamic inflection points where you can figure out when these information assets will become an information liabilities, what we call an information liabilities, so that the cost for the company exceeds the value of your information assets. And I think this is the main revolution, let's say, in terms of record management for the next year, is that you do not want just to apply a standard retention duration based on years or time-based or event-based retention duration. You want to approach that from a more dynamic manner based on the real value for the company of the information you have, and compare that to the cost and the risk you have for this type of information series or information assets, and predict when this information will become electronic trash or garbage, and raise an alert to the information manager so that basically the information governance committee can take a decision to have an early termination or early disposal of this information, or rather to keep it for a longer period of time. So that's basically what the main approach. I will not go into all the criteria about the value and the cost and how we created a certain number of allocation criteria and keys to allocate the value based on in time. Jim will demo that in a couple of minutes. Taras, you can just go to the next slide.
Okay. And Stefan, this makes the point you did earlier that while there are multiple approaches from an economic perspective, an accounting perspective to quantifying value, the answer to what works sort of depends on you and you, the customer, in particular. What works? Where is your company's goodwill? Is the value of what you produce information? Is it relationships? Is it tangible assets, etc.? So. Back to you, Stefan.
Yeah. So as mentioned, we have a very generic approach based on a certain number of indicators that came from the university. So there is a kind of information governance maturity model. Not all customers are equal. So according to various indicators, you can start very rapidly to measure your cost, your value, and your risk, even if you do not have all the criteria qualified into your company, so that you can start with raw approximate figures and refine them over the years, when basically you are able to reach a higher level of maturity in terms of indicators which are related to value, risk, and cost. So it's a very agile and iterative approach, because so you do not have to have plethora of indicators on your information to start applying an Infonomics model. The benefits, of course, are related to the return on investment, because then you can create a certain number of, first you can go to the IT department or your executive and say why you need to keep this information for a certain period of time, so 10 years, 20 years, and so on, because each represents a certain value and an expected value for the company, or vice versa. You can right now better see which information series are a cost center for your company, and perhaps it's time to get rid of them. So you can manage other retaining scenarios and so on. What we see also is a form of storage tier optimization scenario. So sometimes it's not worth keeping information in a certain type of repository, which are very expensive. So after a certain period of time, you may want to move this content to a lower, a more affordable storage tier, for example, to the cloud, to Amazon S3, for example, or to Box.com or Dropbox, etc., because this information is not sensitive and you have high volume of information. And so that you can also more easily compute and define when you reach a certain point where it's time to move this information to another storage tier. It's also worth for application.
Stefan, a question came through. A question came through, which I think you answered after it was typed, but I'm going to bring it back up anyway to make sure that the questioner hears. The question is, do you really need to know all of this in order to implement Infonomics, comma, there's no way my customer is going to have all this information? So I think you hit on it, Stefan, that that you start with what you've got, but then in an agile way build it up. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically most of our customers start with a cost-oriented approach. Most of the customers already have a cost of their information per gigabyte per type of repositories. So for example, in SharePoint, it costs that much, and they compute perhaps from a very approximate manner the cost per terabyte of content. And just based on these very simple indicators, we can already model some kind of information cost-oriented approach. Then on top of that, we can have a very high-level approach in terms of value, just calculating a goodwill and then spreading this goodwill based only on the time-based criteria. So this means that in a couple of hours, you can have a first Infonomics model and a first approach up and running. Of course, it will be very approximate in terms of indicators, but it gives some first indication of where are your value and your cost in the various information series. Then you can refine over time according to more criteria, and it's up to every company to define these criteria because not every company has the same criteria.
Okay, thank you.
So we try to apply, in fact, the cost and this value approach to three main domains. So the management and the enforcement of policy. So how do you measure your policy in terms of, for example, in cost or value, the information inventory, so all the information assets you have inventoried into a systems, and then related to that, you need to have some kind of forecast and some trend analysis. So you want to measure what will happen in the next years based on the current stock of information that you have, and based on the past pattern and your content growth, you want to monitor the trend. So the content you still do not have, but that you plan to have in the coming years, which will provide some kind of improvement to perfect your budget approach, both from an IT perspective, but also for a business perspective. The last domain is about the improvement and the better management of legal case management. So especially to know when your legal holds and the content you have over-retained due to some legal holds or because of some legal cases you have in your company, and price this over-retained content, so for internal billing reason, so that you can basically from the information management group or from the IT point of view, rebill this over-retained content, for example, to the legal department, which was another use case from some of our customers.
Thank you, Stefan. What I'm going to do is run with what you've done and actually show the tangible work assets from that effort. So I'm going to show three, we'll call them dashboards, one related to information policy, one related to inventory, and one related to legal case analytics, just like what Stefan was saying. And so I'm actually going to get out of PowerPoint mode to do that. So I mentioned earlier that Glass is a cloud-based system. So what you're seeing here it's one of our demo systems that we've populated with some data. I also mentioned earlier that my view of these things, even going back when I was a propeller-headed developer for SAP, my view on these things was that there's no meaning to them unless they're telling a story that's fairly easily understood. So thankfully the answer to that is yes. So for example, policy trends. Stefan mentioned this. Here's the story that you're seeing here. And in fact, I'll begin with a question. For those of you who would regard yourselves as corporate records managers or other types of retention schedule and policy authors, let me ask you this question. What percentage of your schedule is actually valuable? Now, you could answer that in a couple of ways. You could say, well, what percentage of the schedule is being used, or what percent of the schedule is at least available? Because if you've got, say, 300 record classes, and 200 of them are actually being used to define policy for information assets, well, what is going on with that 100? Why do they exist? So that's the sort of thing that that this dashboard answers. So the policy trends dashboard shows me, for example, total policies. In the case of this is actually a snapshot of customer data. That they actually had kind of a big bucket approach of 50 policies before they implemented our technology, and then when the project kicked off, they defined some additional record series that they needed, so that bumped it up to 67. And so the forecast going forward is that's how that will be. Of those, some percentage of them, this uses the word instantiated just because that was their word. You might say published. You know, some number of policies are approved and validated and understood by the company to matter. In this case, 53 of those, so a subset of those. And of those, 10 and eventually 15 are being used for policy enforcement. So 15 record series of a total of 67 are actually defining the life cycle for information assets. And you may ask yourself, why over time does the number go down? Well, Glass understands when things are going to be disposed. And so part of the view you're seeing here is a calculation of life cycles, that some number of information assets will reach the end of their life cycle, and no additional information assets will be categorized according to that policy, and so therefore only 14 will be in place in 12 and 10, etc. So that's one story. I'm not going to go into all of these. I won't. For example, you know, what if is a very interesting dashboard, but I'm not going to hit on that today. Stefan did mention inventory statistics. So again, what's the story here? Well, the story that this is telling me is what percentage of my content is where. So SharePoint Online has about a third, Windows Share Drive another third, Box.com another third, and some little pie slivers of things sitting on Google Drive and oh no, I'm sorry, Box. Anyway, so I can see where my information assets are. I can see where the forecast growth of those is. And Stefan also mentioned that costs can be factored into those. That, for example, Amazon S3 is a very inexpensive place to store things, whereas SharePoint on-premise is a very expensive place to store things. And so some of those what-if analysis can help you make plans around, since you know what content is going to be where over time. You can also apply those costs to help you plan out storage costs, or make the case for alternative storage systems if budgets are constrained. Last one I'll show you today, the Infonomics dashboard. Again, a reminder, we've got lots of dashboards, and we could spend several hours walking through the stories that each of them are telling. But I won't. I'll honor our time, and we'll be done here by the top of the hour. The Infonomics dashboard takes some of those principles that Stefan was talking about, of cost, of risk, of value. It also adds the other underlying bits of data that Glass has about the governance program and the content system, and applies those to tell the story. So that same customer data set, you can see in this case that we've got some amount of content, in this case measured by numbers of components, so maybe about 7.5 million, jumps up to 22 million when the system when Glass went operational. Of those, I guess about maybe about 8 million had already been over-retained, and so there we are. But the trend line also provides the value of those, which, as you'll see, reduces over time. Information assets can be depreciated, should be depreciated in the same way that other assets are, and this applies that. And then also shows me kind of, you know, the accumulated numbers. For example, the accumulated operating costs are grow up by 2037 to you know, over 20 million. Anyway, so stories, and we can show and hide trends and do different types of analyses on these. Last one I'll show you, since Stefan mentioned it, are the legal e-discovery steps. So Glass is not an e-discovery platform. I don't want to make it sound otherwise. We've got very good friends in that space, some of whom, hello guys, you've dialed in today. Good to see you. But if we're the means for enforcing content life cycles, we can also be the means for enforcing temporary suspensions of those. That's our view of a legal hold. And so since it was first released, Glass had the ability to define legal cases, and within legal cases, legal holds, in order to preserve potentially sensitive data. This view tells that story. So in our demo data set, we've pretended to have two cases, Acme versus Demo and Acme versus Mr. Smith. And I see that there's one item under hold for Mr. Smith and another 49 for Demo. I can see of those that some number of them, I guess that's about 16, 18, would have already been disposed of had they not been placed under legal hold. But they are under legal hold, and Glass is going to make sure that the otherwise eligible disposition would not occur. And so part of the e-discovery statistics that you should have visibility into include how much do your legal holds cost you. I have a handful of customers, mostly in the healthcare space, that have placed every bit and byte of data under legal hold because they're fighting some antitrust type of activity. And they're doing that kind of to play it safe. I have a disagreement with that approach, that they know the classifications that some of the governed content is being placed under, and can therefore safely dispose of those, but they are choosing not to. Well, the dashboard is telling them, these are very small numbers. I mean, there are only 49 items under hold, but imagine if there were hundreds of millions, that there's a cost associated with that, storage cost, and potentially some of these other soft costs that Stefan was talking about. So back to you, wouldn't it be nice to have a governance platform that provides visibility into your policy, into your inventory, applies cost, risk, and value metrics to that content to allow you to make well-informed decisions about policy. Stefan was talking about the possibility that perhaps my retention on something gets rid of content before the value is exhausted out of it. Maybe that retention period should be longer, even though that could incur some extra storage costs. The value's there. So again, stories, and I could get bogged down in the stories. I won't. So let's wrap up. Our next, here we'll go back to presentation mode. I told you earlier that I was gonna make the offer. I'm making it now. Glass is a subscription-based platform. Depending on the level of subscription, the price is as low as $0. We have a free offering, and that's not a trial. It's free for as long as you need it. So take a look. Go to cloud.glassig.com, sign up, set up a tenant, define some policies, enforce those on systems, and you can get some visibility into what we're about. Finally, oh, not that one. That's the wrong commercial. Let's go back to the original commercial, and we'll leave it here while I check for questions and comments. 6 weeks from today, we will do a deep dive into the management of your information inventory, being able to search for things across multiple systems, potentially apply legal holds, protect those, do metadatabase searches, etc. So that's going to be a much heavier demo time and a lot less about concept than what we did today. But what we did today is very much kind of on the cutting edge of the industry. The Infonomics discipline Stefan was saying is where we believe records management and information governance is going to go over the next year. We firmly believe that, and over, in fact, about the next decade, it's going to very much change people's thinking about the value of programs like ours. So that said, we had to spend a lot of time on the concept side and comparatively little time on the demo side. If you've got more questions on those, then please ask us. So I'm going to check the chat window now to see what questions we've got. Okay, so this question comes in every time. I guess it's sort of a compulsory type thing. Will the recording be available? Yes. Those of you who have dialed in, you've got the you've got the content. Maybe you took notes, etc. But if you'd like to share with colleagues, or a lot of you who have dialed in today are consultants, and you were taking a look at this on behalf of a customer. So if you would like to share that with your customer, we'll push the link out within about the next week or so. Another question is being typed. Storage current. All right, so this goes back to one of the dashboards. So let me go back to that. Trend. So the question took us back to the trend analysis, and can we take a look at forecasts and do what if analysis on those? And the answer is yes. I'm not going to do that right now in the time we've got. We do have, as I said, what if analysis. Those tend to be very customer specific and meaningful, really on the depending on the metrics, depending on the cost, depending on whether or not we're talking cloud-based systems or on-premise. We have a lot of customers that do what if analysis on when should things be sent to long-term archives like Centera. So the question is, can I do what if analysis on these trends and repositories? And the answer is yes. I'll leave it at that for now, and ask that the responder kind of contact me directly, and I'll set up a very specific session on that. Okay, we've hit the end of our time. Right at the top of the hour. I appreciate your attendance. I appreciate the questions. Stefan, I very much appreciate you. I know we're getting close to the end of your day in Geneva, so thanks for your time today. And oh, one more question. Okay, so the question is, was a paper produced related to the Infonomics? And Stefan, I'm going to pass that to you, because I think the answer is yes, but I have no idea what the status of it is. So the work that you did with the university, is there some sort of output of that beyond what we made available in our product here?
Yeah, we are finalizing a version that will be published on our website probably during the fall of this year.
Okay.
So for the moment, it's a draft, and it will be available on our website in a couple of months.
Okay, outstanding. Thanks again for your time. We've hit the top of the hour. I very much appreciate your attendance and attention and interest in what we're about. So those of you in the U.S., have a great rest of the day. Those of you in Europe, have a great evening, and thanks again, and we'll see you on June 27th.